Hello, my name is Demi Michelle Schwartz. I'm so excited to be part of the 2025 Writers Workout Conference. Thank you so much to Teresa and the entire team for having me. It is such an honor to be here. My presentation is called A Peek into Publishing Podcasts, and I cannot wait to get into that. But first, I would love to share a little about myself. I'm an author from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, represented by Michelle Jackson at LCS Literary. I primarily write young adult fiction, focusing on the fantasy and thriller genres, but I love to explore other genres and age categories in my short stories, which can be found in various anthologies. Anthologies are my whole obsession. I could do a whole chat on that. Also, on top of that, I am a freelance editor through my own independently run services, Amethyst Ink Editorial. I am the host of Literary Blonde Publishing Podcast. I'm an editor for Revise and Resubmit, commonly known as #RevPit. On top of that, I am a publicist and anthology editor for Wilding Publishing. And I'm currently an intern at the Purcell Agency. When I'm not busy in the publishing industry, I am chasing my other dream as an award-winning songwriter and recording artist. And I'm also the host of an award-nominated podcast called Right on Track, a songwriting podcast. And I'm so excited to be here to talk to you today all about podcasts. Since 2021, I have been involved with podcasts as a host and as a guest. And so through my experiences, I've gained a lot of insight and knowledge that I cannot wait to share with you, specifically for publishing. So before I dive into the presentation, I wanted to share a little about what inspired me to start Literary Blend in the first place. So I need to back it up to 2021. I started my other podcast, Right on Track, in May of 2021. And this was around the time when I really started to get into my music career. I was doing some research for music podcasts that I could appear on, and I started to see a pattern. Several of those podcasts were very specific of the kind of guests that they wanted to have on. And as a new independent artist at the time, I felt like I couldn't check their boxes. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to start my own podcast that's inclusive for anyone who wanted to be on. And over the past few years, I've had the absolute honor of chatting with independent artists, Grammy winners, Emmy winners, very established individuals in the industry, and also artists who are just starting out. And it's been such a joy and a delight. And so once I started to get into publishing, I had several people come to me and say, why don't you host a publishing podcast too? And that never crossed my mind. And so I started to do some digging into publishing podcasts when I was a queer and author. I was doing a lot of listening to interviews with agents and listening to podcasts to learn more about the craft. And I saw a similar pattern with music where there were a lot of publishing podcasts that were specific for debut authors or middle grade authors or YA authors or specifically for agents in certain genres. And I thought, again, I want to create an inclusive show for anyone who wants to come on and chat about publishing, the writing process, and anything related to the life of being an author or the industry. And so I launched Literary Blend, and as the title suggests, it is a blend of many different topics, many different kinds of guests. The episodes are called chapters because I'm extra, and I've hosted this show since March of 2024, so it's been about a year, and it has been a total joy, and it's still going strong. And through my experiences with that show, I have made wonderful connections, and I'm going to share with you how you can build connections by chasing your journey in podcasting. So stay tuned because here comes all the info. All right, so first up, I'm going to share why publishing podcasts are beneficial in general. There are many benefits, and the first one is they are accessible. They are on many different platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon. Many are on YouTube now, and so because they're so accessible, people can tune into them from all around the world. Like writing conferences that can be in person and other events that can be in certain locations, those limit attendance and the kinds of guests who can be there to learn. But podcasts can be listened to from anywhere in the world, and that's super cool. And also because of that, they're free. And so basically you're getting free resources and you're able to learn and gain knowledge in the industry simply by listening. Also, because there are so many different kinds of publishing podcasts, there are things for everybody. So you can find a podcast that you want to commit to and listen to every episode, or if you are interested in, say, learning about how to develop your querying skills, or if you're interested in character development or setting description, there are podcast episodes out there specifically on those topics, and you can do quick searches and find those episodes. And so there's literally a podcast out there for anything in publishing, and that's what's so great. And because there are so many podcasts, you can easily find the kinds of shows that you're interested in and the kinds of episodes that you're interested in listening to in order to gain and tailor your listening experience to you. Also, when it comes to publishing podcasts, they are a fantastic way to network. And you will hear me talk about networking several times during this presentation because networking is gold in the publishing industry. When you listen to podcasts, you are getting to know the hosts. You are also getting to know the guests. And there are many different kinds of guests, from authors to agents to editors to publicists. And as you're listening to these episodes, you're familiarizing yourself with publishing professionals and others in the industry. And if you want a career in publishing, you're going to have to make those connections and know the people in the industry. And by listening to the podcast, that's a fantastic way to start familiarizing with yourself with the kinds of people in the industry and who you want to build connections with and so on. Also, a huge benefit of podcasts is the conversational style. Like I said, you can learn a lot of things by listening to podcasts, but you can also learn things by reading craft books and reading textbooks and reading articles online, but that's not the same experience as actually listening to people talk. When you're listening to people talk, you get firsthand experiences and insight. And I don't know about you, but when I listen to somebody talk, I connect way more than reading an article on my phone. And it can be the exact same information, but there's something about the human connection when you're listening to somebody that really makes something click in your head or really makes you go, oh, I've totally been there, I get that. And when you're listening to publishing professionals talk about different things in publishing, you really start to know like you're not alone in the industry and that others have gone through the same things you're going through and that others have learned the things that you need to learn. And so it's a really great way to really take a step back and say, okay, I may be in my room by myself or in my office by myself writing my books alone, but you can realize by listening to podcasts that there are so many others doing the exact same thing you're doing, and it's a great way to connect. Speaking of connection, podcasts create communities. I know with Literary Blend, my listeners share the episodes, they chat about the episodes. My guests have connected through the episodes, through referrals. Like I've had authors reach out and say, hey, my friend was on your show and they referred me. And so you start to build this community aspect, and also looking at the greater writing community. Podcasts are a great way to see others in the writing community connect because, again, networking connection is huge. And by being a listener of a podcast, you can begin to further your involvement in the publishing industry. So those are some fantastic benefits of publishing podcasts in general. And next, I'm going to share why you, as an author, should be seeking out publishing podcast opportunities. So why you as an author should seek out publishing podcast opportunities. The first big point I really want to stress is that if you are just starting out and you're not published yet, start doing interviews and seeking out guest appearances now. I know when I was just starting out in publishing and I didn't have any anthology acceptances, I was still querying. I was like, I don't have anything to offer. Why would I want to be on a podcast? Or why would anybody want to talk to me on a podcast? And the truth is that I realized that being published or having an agent does not define your worth in this industry. And you have so much to share no matter where you are in your journey. The very first publishing podcast I was on was my friend Cassie's. She has a podcast for Gen Z writers, and she was like, hey, do you want to be on? And this was when I was still querying, and I was like, yeah, okay, I'll be on. And that was very fun. And I found that there was so much I was able to share during that podcast episode, even though I wasn't agented yet or didn't have anthologies out yet. And so I would love to encourage you to start looking for these opportunities now, because the first big thing in terms of why podcasts are beneficial is you will start to become recognized. If people are listening to podcasts and they hear your voice, they'll start to get to know you. They might look you up on social media and connect with you. which is just going to build your network, like I said earlier. And so it's never too early to start looking for these podcast opportunities and seeking out the ones that do accept you, no matter where you are on your journey. Speaking of the networking, when you book podcast appearances, you're going to build your network by connecting with the host and also their listenership. You may even find readers through those podcast episodes. So it's a great way for you to center yourself and to share your experiences, but also promote your work on those episodes when given the opportunity. I will chat a little later about how to present yourself during these podcast episodes and what to expect. But the main thing is that when you're going on these shows, it's beneficial for you to frame your mindset of, this is a chance for me to network and to make connections and to share my experiences and have conversations, not just about promoting yourself. And I'll get into that a little more later. But another reason why you should be seeking out these opportunities is because it's a way for you to give back. And I am a firm believer in giving back to the industry. And if you want the industry to be there for you, you have to be there for it as well. And being on a podcast and dedicating your time to chatting with the host and sharing your experiences, you're giving back to the community. Because tying back to what I said at the beginning of this presentation, podcasts are an amazing way of gaining insight, and by listening to people having conversations, listeners are going to get so much information and hear so many experiences that help them along their journeys. I dedicate so much of my time hosting a show, chatting to all these guests, and being the one to give others a platform and distributing these conversations for others to hear. But you as the guest can offer so much. If you have had an experience that you feel others would be benefiting from hearing, you can get on a podcast and share that and help others. I think helping others is so important, and podcast episodes are a great way to do that. And a final point I want to make on this is just overall support. If you want a long-term career in publishing, you're going to have to support others. And by being on a podcast episode, and by interacting with the hosts and getting to know other guests and listeners, you are supporting others. And I think that's really important, because when your book comes out, you want others to support you. And so showing support by listening to podcast episodes is huge, and it will show others in the industry that you really care and you want to support other people. And if you put that energy out into the world, when it's your turn, that energy will come back to you. Okay, so now I'm going to chat about pitching yourself to podcasts. So if you're listening and you're like, oh, I want to be on publishing podcasts, that sounds super fun. I'm going to give you some helpful tips to allow you to pitch yourself successfully. So the first thing I want to say is that podcast spots are very limited. And as somebody who hosts 2 podcasts, it breaks my heart to have to tell people I'm full, I'll put you on my wait list, or that you're not a good fit. It breaks my heart, but that's just the reality of the situation. And so if you want to be on a publishing podcast, you need to recognize that all of your emails aren't going to result in guest appearances, and that's okay. It happens to me and it happens to everyone else. But you could definitely raise your chances by landing a spot on a podcast if you do some things. So the first one is to research. Like I said earlier, there are many different kinds of publishing podcasts, and you need to do some reflecting on you as an author and what you can offer, and finding a show that you fit. For example, if there is a podcast on horror and you are a fantasy author, you probably shouldn't be pitching yourself to the horror podcast, because they would be like, oh, your book sounds super cool, but this podcast is for horror, so you're not a good fit. If you are a YA author, you shouldn't be pitching yourself to a middle grade podcast. If you're an author and not an agent, you shouldn't be pitching yourself to a podcast that exclusively interviews agents. See what I mean? So by doing research, you will find the kinds of shows that you can appear on and then you would be a fit for. This leads me to my next point. Familiarize yourself with the host and the podcast style. Every podcast is different. My podcast is conversational. It is not strict interview style. Some podcasts are very strict interview style. And so it's a good idea to listen to some episodes and to familiarize yourself with the kind of podcast, because you want to know what you're getting into. If strict interview stresses you out, you don't want to pitch yourself to those kinds of podcasts. If a free-flowing conversation, if that stresses you out, you're going to want to find podcasts that have very strict questions, where maybe the host sends the questions in advance so you can prepare. So there's different kinds of styles, and you want to do some research and listen so you're able to determine what show you would feel most comfortable being on. Once you find shows that you think you would be a fit for, it's time to send the email. Number 1, personalize it. So if you're sending an email to me, it'd be nice to say hi to me at the top. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten emails that, especially for my songwriting one, I got one that was the wrong name and I didn't respond. And then when they followed up, they got the wrong name again. And I understand that things can happen, but when you're following up with somebody and you get it wrong again, that shows me that you don't really know about the podcast. Also, it's really important to let the host know that you care about their podcast and that you're interested in being on theirs specifically. This is not a copy and paste situation. Trust me, we know. If you copy and paste your email, or if it's a blast email, we can totally tell because there's no personalization. So for example, if I have one spot available and I have 2 emails from potential guests, and the one is personalized and the other one looks like a copy and paste, I'm pretty sure you can guess which author I would have on. And so there are many different ways that you could personalize your email. If you listen to the podcast, a good way to do so is by saying, hey, I listened to your episode with so-and-so guest and I really liked what you said about blah, blah, blah. Or, oh my goodness, my best friend was on your podcast and I love listening to it, and I thought I would reach out to see if you had availability for me too. So there's different approaches you can take, but when you make it clear that you are intending this email specifically for that host, you really stand out. Another way that you can stand out is to pitch yourself in a way that frames your guest appearance as a benefit to the podcast. So I want to stress here that every publishing podcast is going to give you an opportunity to promote yourself, your social media, your websites, your books. That's part of this process. But your goal when pitching a publishing podcast is not to make it all about you and your book, because that shows that you're kind of just in it for yourself and you're not really in it for the connections and to share your experiences with other people. And so it's always smart to pitch yourself of what can you offer to this podcast, with the knowledge that during the episode at some point the host will give you a chance to promote yourself and your work. So for example, very recently, there was a podcast that I really, really wanted to be on. It was told to me by a friend of mine who's a literary agent, and I was like, oh, I want to be on it too. So I checked out the podcast, I listened to a couple episodes, and I noticed the kinds of conversations on the show, and I scrolled through the topics and saw what was already covered. And instantly after doing that, 2 potential topics came to mind that weren't yet covered on the show, and ones that I felt like I could speak on. And so when I emailed the host, I said, hey, I heard about your podcast through, and then I mentioned the name. And I said, I attached my publishing CV if you wanted to get to know me a little more. I'll talk about that in a second too. But then I basically said, I noticed that these topics weren't covered on your show yet, and I was thinking that these 2 topics one or the other could be a nice addition to the podcast. And I basically listed the topic ideas and shared the kinds of things I was thinking about talking about with either of those topics. And I basically said, if either of those interest you, I'd be honored to be on the show. And if neither of those interest you, I'm happy to share more topic ideas. And I got a response the next day to be on the podcast. And so that was a really clear way of me presenting myself in a way of knowing the podcast, presenting myself in a way of showing what I can offer. And that turned out really well. So the next thing I want to point out is, like I said, I shared my CV, and you don't have to go that extreme, but you should give some kind of way for the host to learn more about you. Simply sharing your website is a great way. If you don't have a website, you should probably get one. That could be a whole other conversation, but you can share your social media. just give the host some other way to get to know you a little bit, because that can definitely help with their decision-making process. So after you have all that, all in your email, super professional, you hit send, and then comes the waiting period. So I got lucky with that one podcast and heard back right away, but that's not always the case. Podcasting is something I do for free, and I know a lot of other podcasters do this for free because we have a passion for it, and it's not our job. And so response times can be slow. And I'm going to give you some insight into how I do things just to give you a little bit perspective. So I have an inbox for my Literary One podcast. I have a separate email. And when I get emails through there, I don't always respond, especially when I'm booked for a couple months like I am now. I wait until I have availability to reach out to people and say, hey, I have a spot. Or if it sounds really, really interesting, I tell them I put them on their wait list. But I don't always check that email because I'm always busy with other things and I get to it when I can. And so there are guests in the past that I've emailed months after they emailed me to offer them a spot on the show. And so just be aware of the wait time that can come with pitching podcasts. And if you're a querying author or if you've done any kind of submissions in publishing, you know the waiting game, so it's no different. But it never hurts to follow up. So what I suggest is if you email someone and you don't hear back from them, give it a couple weeks and then you can follow up with them. And when people do this for me, this is when I typically respond. So say I'm full for a couple months and I have a pitch sitting in my inbox and I'm like, oh, that's really interesting, but I'll get to it when I have space. If that author emails me again to follow up in a couple weeks, and I always respond and say, hey, I got your first email. I'm currently booked right now, but you're on my wait list and I'll get back to you whenever I have availability. And so that's just a way of putting yourself back on the top and to show the host that you really do want to be on that podcast. So just send a kind follow-up email and they will likely respond. If they don't, you should probably just move on and recognize that maybe they weren't the best fit, or maybe they don't have availability. And the other thing too I want to mention before I move on to the next part of the presentation is that if you don't get on a podcast when you first pitch, that doesn't mean you never can. Especially in music. There were so many music podcasts I wanted to be on early on, and I was just never fit for them right away, and I kept trying, and eventually I got on. And so if you pitch a publishing podcast and they say, oh, not right now, or they don't answer you, you can let a few months go by, or if you have a new book release coming out or whatever, you can try again and see what happens, because you never know. Okay, so you pitched yourself to publishing podcasts. You got yeses. You're all excited. Woohoo, I'm going to be on a publishing podcast. And you're probably wondering, now what do I do? So I'm going to give you some tips for a good recording setup. So first, record in a quiet location. Publishing podcasts and podcasts in general, you want clean audio, and I'm going to give you some more tips for getting clean audio, but the number one thing you can do is to record in a quiet location. We can do some things with audio engineering to clean up audio, but even those of us who know what we're doing, like I have recording software because I'm a musician, and so I know how compression works and how EQ works, but a lot of podcasters don't, and so they kind of just take the audio as it's recorded. And so you really want to deliver the cleanest audio you possibly can. And by recording in a quiet location, that's going to allow you to do that. It's a good idea to record somewhere that has like carpeting, places that doesn't have a lot of echo. So just be mindful where you're recording at. The next recommendation is to wear headphones. I personally make wearing headphones a requirement for mine because sometimes if someone isn't wearing headphones, there can be a weird echo situation going on, and that is a total nightmare in the editing process. Again, with the software I use, I record multi-track, which means I record myself and my guests on separate tracks. So if there's weird stuff going on, I can easily cut the other track when the other person's talking. However, a lot of podcasters don't do it this way because they don't have the music setup that I do. And so you never want to go in assuming like, oh, they could just clean it up. You want the cleanest audio possible. And wearing headphones is going to help so much with that to avoid any kind of echo or feedback from the other side of the call. The other recommendation I have is to use a microphone. So this is one that is a little iffy because not everyone has a microphone, and that's totally understandable. However, if you are planning on doing a lot of podcast interviews, getting a microphone would be a good investment. You do not need to break the bank. There are a ton of affordable ones you can just get through Amazon that can connect to your computer. And so investing in a microphone is going to give you cleaner audio, because any kind of external microphone is going to be way better than your phone speakers or your laptop speakers. And so investing in a microphone is a good way to go, especially if you want to do this often. And the last tip I have is if you are doing a video recording. Some podcasts are only audio, some have video. Mine are personally, I do audio only because editing video can be a nightmare and I don't want to do it. But there are some podcasters that do video too. And in that instance, like recording in a quiet space, you want to record in a professional location and you're aware of what's in your background. So just make sure when you're doing a video recording that your lighting is good and that you don't have any weird stuff in the background. I had a friend once who had a podcast and they were like, they did a video and there was a trash can in the background and they had to I don't know what they did, but just be aware that you don't have any weirdness going on in the background. And so just to recap this, quiet location, get headphones, if you can get a microphone, and if it's video, be aware of what is in your background. All right, so you did your podcast recording. You're super excited. It's going to be coming out for so many people to listen to. And the podcast episode hit all the platforms and it's there for everyone and you're super excited. But now what? So after the episode is out, there are a few things that you probably should do. Number one, thank the host. This feels common sense to me, but I can't tell you how many guests I've had on both podcasts that haven't thanked me. And you know what? That's fine, because I don't do this for any kind of reciprocation. I do it because I love podcasting and I care and I want to give people a platform. But you will be remembered if you say thank you. That's 2 words. You can DM me on Instagram and say thank you. You can send me an email and say thank you. Whoever's podcast you're on, thanking the host really goes a long way and it shows that you care. Another thing that shows that you care is to promote the episode. And this feels common sense too, because if you are on a podcast episode, you probably would want to share that for others to listen to. I'm going to share what my process is. So I share it on social media, and I also share it on my website. So if you ever go to my website, you will see that I have a blog, and something I like to do is monthly wraps. So basically, I do little blog posts and include everything I did that month. Every single interview I've ever done is in a monthly wrap, every single one. That's a way for me to showcase what I've been up to, and that's a way for me to respect the host by sharing their episode. Another thing I do is I share my appearances on specific pages on my website as well. So for music, I have an EPK, which is short for electronic press kit. On there, I have a press section with tons and tons of interviews, reviews, and all of that. That's on there. And since I started to do things more actively in publishing, on my author bio page, if you look at that, you will see a guest appearances section. And on there, I include my appearances at conferences and also any interviews I've done, including podcasts. So I share my guest appearances in many locations. And so those are just some ideas. If you have an author website, for sure, share them there, share it on social media, and let the host know that you really care and that you want to help share that episode, because it's just going to benefit you and allow you to build your network and make connections by others listening to your episode. And lastly, something else you can do when you're on a podcast episode after it comes out is to tell your friends about it. Like I said earlier, I got a couple referrals from authors who said their friends were on my show and they wanted to be on too. And that's super fun to get emails like that. And so if you are on a podcast that you absolutely love and you have some author friends that you think would be fits too, definitely pass the show on to them. And that would be a referral. And so that will put your friend in a good situation too and help them stand out in the pile as well, because that's going to allow them to make a personalized introduction. So those are some things that you can do after the episode comes out. And just remember too, that's a huge win. I think publishing is a place where we can focus so much on all the rejection and all the waiting and all the failures and all the downs and all the ups, but being on a podcast is huge. And so be sure to stop and reflect and celebrate that win. And that is a wrap on a peek into publishing podcast. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you so much again to Teresa and the whole Writers Workout family for having me. If you would like to connect with me on social media, I'm active on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is at Demi Schwartz. You can also head over to my website, demimschwartz.com. Also, since this presentation was all about podcasts, if you would love another one to listen to, definitely check out Literary Blend. And if you would like to be a guest on the show, definitely reach out to me. My email is on the Literary Blend page on my website. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much again for watching, and I hope you enjoy all the other fabulous presentations during this fantastic conference. Thank you.